Hello everyone, today we talk about the Olympians. Our Indo-European religious history series continues. As you have probably realized, we are in the midst of a pretty consistent series about this. We talk about Indo-European history more often than before. It's not going to be always the same kind, but obviously there is a lot of space for especially traditional content, and I think these videos this autumn are paving the way to many other things that we will be talking, about concerning all these topics as they are deeply entwined. So, especially in this colder season where people are more at home, etc., I thought to concentrate a bit of this during the weekends, especially. Just the other day, I explained to you how or why I distribute content the way I do at this moment. There is a broader and overarching strategy. Let's get to the fundamentals, because this is what these videos are just establishing here. It's important to do that well. We also recently made a video about the Dorian migration, all the controversy revolving around it, but also the more evidently and deeply rooted meaning behind that, the spread of and reinforcement, if anything, of a very particular spiritual principle that had already characterized the earlier Hellenic history during the Mycenaean period. Today we essentially look at the aftermath of this, and so the new phase, if you want, of the Dorian Olympian deities that, as you know, do reflect a broader sort of Apollonian Olympus, in fact, also in the other branches of the Indo-European peoples, with all the specificities, however, of the Hellenic bias and how this sort of manifested. As you know, I made already a couple of videos also about the early, probably the sagas of the Hellenic world, to say what's the mythological foundation behind Hellenic identity. In that sense, we already observe like a particularly courageous foundational sort of pillar, cornerstone character of the divinely achieving heroic foundation of the Hellenic world. In other words, like sort of all the Indo-European branch have something that really characterizes them in a way, and the Hellenic one, for different reasons, is the one that second only in the broader Indo-European arc to the Vedas, and the most important in Europe in this sense, as far as the most crystal clear defined sort of divine transfigurational achievement of the hero in the figure of Hercules. They will not talk specifically about him. Surely we'll have to do something sooner or later about Hercules. It's very important also to compare him in these various ages of Hellenic history that is very old, and in this sense is very stratified. It also sort of modernizes and secularizes the earliest, paradoxically. Achilles is, for example, hated by Apollo, and he actually ends up in hell. So you see there a completely different mentality regarding this compared properly to the foundational principle, and all a different story. Again, we could easily make a numeric series that would be extremely interesting, as a matter of fact. But when we make this Indo-European history, religions mostly, content, the most important aspect is metaphysical, is spiritual, is conceptual. It's not important the when or where. This actually was very important to them, thinking about Delphi, but it's not in a sort of modern secular sense, like not even sort of the later Greeks would indulge in, absolutely, as they were, as a matter of fact, a traditional society, very differently from our own. So the key to actually give a more, at least 21st century conventional face to these peoples is understanding the unconventional one. And you cannot study Indo-Europeistics by any stretch of the imagination if you don't have a religiously foundational key to that, and to which you can also, and also a linguistic one for that matter, to which you can demonstrate how or why we know, first of all, that these people believe what they believe. Because I haven't had so much criticism regarding these videos. Actually, I see that you overwhelmingly appreciate them. But there is, as you know, an enormous problem in Indo-Europeistics, and or at least there is an attitude towards it that has somehow skeptically muddied the waters a little bit regarding the actual epistemological potential of Indo-Europeistic heuristics, so to say. These videos aim to completely dismantle that approach, and of course, the more we're going to cover this, the more it's becoming really a powerful library that everybody can access, also in not just in an anecdotal sense. My individual videos already by themselves are very long, but imagine all together what they can do, what they're already doing. This will be able just to promote the channel in general, to create more debate around it, and to fortify its same foundations with a larger debate following and more. Now, let's start it in this way. Imagine in the primordial obscurity that lay hidden within the deepest prehistoric strata of the Hellenic world, right? You have, as in other branches, by the way, of the European people's mythology, the dark and shadowy conflicts which had been long raging between the diurnal principle of light and order. I just recently made a video titled Indo-European Order's Consciousness, as a matter of fact. So on the one side, these were the conqueror's spiritual standpoint, and on the other side, the nocturnal ones of chaos and dissolution, right? Essentially, it's a clash between the paternal sovereignty that belonged to the heavens and the maternal, all-engulfing embrace that belonged to the earth. This is a very recurring, overarching theme. Those who think that this is purely a dualistic opposition in particular are deeply wrong, and in fact, all the videos we made on the topic are not mostly, as most people sort of stop to like simple dichotomies, monodimensional sort of counterposition of elements, but in fact a hierarchically and organically disciplined and integrated element as a whole, right? There is a ruler and a ruled, right? There's always a difference in quality between the two, but without the wall, you cannot achieve divinity. That was the ultimate point of the conquerors, as opposed of the conquered that had mostly self-dissolving, tectonic, superstitious beliefs and identities. What we're looking at with the Olympians, as we've seen partially, in fact, in the video about the Dorian migration, is how this clash finally underwent a profound and decisive resolution. There is something epoch-making between the end of the second and the beginning of the first millennium BC, because as we've seen with the Hellenic and the Italic migrations in particular, they're largely going parallel. How? Like the Indo-Europeans in these regions of Europe had already come from quite a while, from millennia before. But we have a larger and fundamentally definitive settlement of these peoples in a way that is sort of overall politically, culturally, morally ascertainable, better documented, and in this sense establishing great part through, for example, the Hellenic, the Roman civilizations, what we understand as a huge chunk of Western identity as a whole, right? There would be constant sort of highs and lows in terms of moral force and what the original principle of the Indo-European conquerors would undergo. Just yesterday I made a pretty sort of robust response to essentially, whom in general it was sort of very curious also about all this, because it doesn't seem to me that the single most important aspect of Indo-Europeistics is continuously skipped in an ahistorical sense, mostly looking just at archaeogenetics and measuring people like animals fundamentally, as opposed from a broader imperial, Catholically traditional, spiritual point of view, which the Indo-Europeans to the fullest embodied at this point. And yes, Catholic is an actual word that you want to keep in mind in trying to really see for what historically meant, which 99% of the times, if you haven't, unless you have watched my videos, you haven't the palest idea of what it actually is, right? What it actually means. Now, these ancient antagonisms we're discussing here were, in fact, to never be quelled, in a sense, but they were transmuted, in the case of the Greeks that we discussed today, into the articulate, luminous, and fully coherent expression of the Olympian religion, so to say. Religion isn't even the proper word for antiquity, as a matter of fact, even though I've never opened that sort of terminological parenthesis yet on Schwerpunkt. I actually made a video about that, but there is also something we can't simply digress today on again. These archaic antagonisms, whose roots reached from back to Indo-European prehistory, gradually dissolved when Apollo, whose name is Apollon from the Proto-Indo-European apel, that is to say, to shine, burn together with the adjunctive suffix lon, right, decisively slew the chthonic serpent Python, Python if you want in English, whose name in fact is Python from a pre-Hellenic substrate language, perhaps related to Luvian put, which means to swell, to rot, which is particularly fitting for the primordial snake, eroding in fact the roots of the tree of the world, or otherwise unrelated, because it may have again been something else as well. We'll come back on the etymologies here, because apel of course is connected also with other important words having to do with the starry sky and the burning, in fact, sun, and in this sense Apollo properly incarnating that principle. This occurred, this Apollonian slaughter of the serpent's Python, famously enough, at the site of Delphi. Right? If you really want to visit, like, the single most important place in Greece is not, I don't know, Mycenae or Athens or wherever, it is Delphi. The name of which, again, is very interesting. Again, we always must fall back on linguistics when we study Indo-Europeistics, because it explains everything. As I also made a video a couple of months ago about properly Rta, and so the Vedic version of this. This is Gvelb, the Vomb, and thus navel of the world, the center of the world, the one from which divinity was properly conceived once again to rise to heaven. I explained this also in the video about Nu and the sacred waters that the save from the waters, at least when the waters are redeemed as holy ones. This act symbolically proclaimed the triumph of solar clarity over the darkness of the telluric depths, when Theseus, whose name is of uncertain origin, possibly pre-Hellenic, to know the truth, because, as you know, Hellenic culture is incredibly stratified. So, yes, it had some more foundational point, but it's just like the Vedas again in India. There was an enormous chthonic substratum, and this is in part why the Indo-European conquest in these regions was likely accomplished again, but by the most powerful of the Indo-European peoples in the moment, truly left that enormous mark in Hellenic culture, symbolized, of course, by the Apollonian, the eminently Apollonian symbolism and foundation of this part of the West. Remember that at Delphi, the rite of the serpent's slaying had to be repeated periodically, because it was believed that from this very center of the globe, which was also between heaven and earth, of course, the earth had to be routinely subjugated, otherwise it could come back, right? Theseus vanquished the hybrid monster known as the Minotaur, the etymology of which is sort of unproblematic. It comes from Minos' bull, right? We don't know what Minos actually means, the origin are no. deep inside the labyrinthine palace of Crete, thereby embodying the heroic imposition of rational form upon monstrous confusion. Right, a sort of Babel tower that is stormed and is slaughtered of its corrupted, in fact deformed, degenerated inhabitants. This, of course, has a lot to do with probably the Minoan culture that in many ways had embodied some of the sort of most sort of pushed Pelasgian, Gynecocratic cultures out there. We'll talk about all these superimpositions because especially the Hellenic world is very densely characterized by that, so that you don't accuse me of simply cutting with the hatchet sort of the Indo-Europeans, abstract Indo-Europeans from one side and sort of abstract Pelasgians from another. There was a very specific context that we can approach there. I will not digress. We will talk about the sea peoples. In the video about Dorian migration, we already talked about the fall of the Mycenaean civilization, the so-called Bronze Age collapse. Overstated or understated, what is clear is that the Hellenic culture that reemerges from this world is much more sort of rank and file strong, a bit like a phalangitic host already accomplished, again, at least over the following centuries. It was a very gradual process against the superiority of the monarch of the war chariot in particular, that in this sense would be very interesting to appreciate in the political social segmentation, aside from our Bronze Age military historical series, of the early Indo-European conquerors in a much greater, proportionally greater Pelasgian population, and other reasons in any case. When upon the sacred hill that was dedicated to Ares, whose name is from the Proto-Indo-European Haios, meaning war god, or to join, to fit, which properly talks about the rank and file, and is obviously always sort of defeated by Athena as the Apollonian deity that we will see now. So Ares is not an extraneous element in the Indo-European pantheon, but it serves the specific purpose of showing that old sort of warrioristic, that is to say self-referential, essentially egoistic, and sociopathic, psychopathic. Look at Achilles, also in the etymology of his name, what it brought to his people. Element that is crushed under the heels of the pure, highest Indo-European clarity, which corresponds also to the idea of the citizen soldier, and so something that will not entirely succeed in the sort of later Hellenic history, because the Romans actually get the best combination of virtus et disciplina, so to say, but it's something that we'll talk better on another occasion. The Hellenes were pretty warlike in the early ages. We sort of anesthetize them a bit too much in our sort of, especially as it happened in the 70s and the 80s in the post-Vietnam traumatized kind of scholarship that had to tell you how it was about minimal combat and was no kind of warrior ethos, but still Ares, the god of martial valor, is always defeated, and unavoidably so, by the highest Apollonian principle, probably the mind, being born, as you know, from the head of Zeus himself. And when this, again, back to the point, when the sacred hill that was dedicated to Ares already, right, and so it already belonged to, say, the Mycenaean period, Orestes, whose name comes from hair, from the Proto-European hair to rise, più the agenitive stes, and so it's a new rise, right, and Orestes is a central figure in Hellenic mythology. This hero received, in fact, full judicial absolution, famously enough, for the matricide of Clytemnestra, whose name is from the Proto-Indo-European klevos, that is to say, fame plus meant to think, and the feminine tra. So a symbol, essentially, of some sort of usurpation. You know that around that there is the slaughter of the Amazons as well, and again, we'll get to that myth. We don't have all the time in the world today, but Orestes, in achieving so, so refusing essentially the civilization of the matter. They also made a video connected with the Indo-European Urfolk, and so this massive takeover that would periodically reboot itself in European history. Orestes had carried out a divine mission, essentially, to avenge his father, Agamemnon. That is quite meaningful, because if you look at the Homeric tradition, Agamemnon is the leader of the Achaeans, of the Mycenaeans in this sense, and his name famously means to lead, from high to lead, and men, which means mind in Proto-Indo-European, and therefore essentially expressing the reason why the Dorians had taken over. In a broader sense, again, the Hellenic peninsula, essentially to reaffirm once and for all the supremacy of paternal lineage and patriarchal justice over those ancient claims of maternal blood guilt that had been relentlessly pursued by the Erinyes, right? The famous Furies in the Latin version, whose name comes from the Proto-Indo-European her, that means to move angrily. As a matter of fact, it's a bit a host of, of untamed Valkyries, because the Valkyrie, as you know, at that point is also the transfigured. It's like the field says, the transfigured angelic woman of the transfigured soul of the same warrior that leads him to heaven. These are the Furies that you have to, in fact, summon during combat and tame and possess and transform into those heavenly women. Even though the etymology of Erinyes may be also of pre-Hellenic source, so we're not entirely sure. This doesn't matter. Perfectly, the myth of Orestes is very famous. Apollo and Athena save him from the Erinyes on that occasion, which is even more sort of archetypally meaningful as a complete association of the Apollonian, the Olympian dimension, to back the hero, to reaffirm properly the virility of the Hellenes that had already been there in the Mycenaean period, and that had been declining and being taken over by the Pelasgian feminine cult that was sort of still very florid and alive under the heel of leaders like Agamemnon. All right. So this entire transformation constituted what Giambattista Vico described as a poetic wisdom. Right. There is something about the Hellenic sagas that incarnate a bit in that literally genial and at times very intellectualized but still valid vision of this spiritual past that, as you know, will turn in actual tragedies, in theatrical spectacles that were nothing but the older representation of the right, mimicking what had literally happened in the myth. And so the reaffirmation, as we've seen with Apollo at Delphi, of probably this virile rule over the feminine cults of the earth, and that in the words of the famous Italian scholar of the 18th century, that, by the way, shows how the Enlightenment was just partially about what we think of some sort of modernistic or secularistic degeneracy, truly becomes also in the seminal value that, of course, Hellenic mythology, sort of drama, and more has for Western identity as a whole. This truly poetic wisdom, so this tale, that this expression that contains the very seed of Olympian spirituality, right? This entire transformation brought into being a wholly new consciousness of human agency and of cosmic harmony, a consciousness that Plutarch would, much later, of course, encapsulate in the famous assertion that nothing of any real substance existed before the foundational civilizing acts of Theseus, the quintessential civilizer who unified Attica and established orderly institutions. And raiding, by the way, with his ships all around in the typical demigod, sort of Bronze Age, and later Bronze Age, if anything, this transitional phase of sort of sea people raids and more, right, against the sort of the other cultures of the world in the wake of this massive Indo-European migration that we can, again, at that point, see as a massive tidal shift. Again, in the same chronology from southern Scandinavia across Central Europe to the Balkan to the Italian peninsulas and beyond. As a new day broke over the densely forested summits of Europe's most ancient and venerable landscape, it diffused an auroral radiance that was comparable to the ethereal luminescence of the Olympus itself. The name Olympus, from the Proto-Indo-European Olkos, which means height, or from a pre-Hellenic source. Again, this is really typical in Hellenic mythology. Let's not repeat ourselves. The symbolism is what matters. Right? We'll talk more and better about the heavenly summit that the Olympus became, literally through, again, Hellenic cultural dominance at this point, the synonym for any other heavenly mountain. Exactly as that divine mountain depicted in the Homeric epic, by the way, and we're here also along the same chronology. The goddess Athena, frankly my favorite goddess as a matter of fact, whose name it may also come from a pre-Hellenic substrate, possibly containing sharp. This is particularly evident, as you know, if you know about her cult in Athens, all the sort of the archaeological continuity of previous times, but also way before. This is completely normal, right? As the divine conquest had literally transfigured this very cult, and Athena is herself the symbol of such angelic and at the same time devastatingly etheric, rational and military power. Rational also understood as from the Latin root, but in the sense not a rationalistic or a rationalizing, but properly in the sense of order. That's the Roman definition. That is much deeper, in fact, the conventional meaning that we give to reason today, especially after the age of the Enlightenment and so on. So never betray the etymology of your native tongues, all right? Because they give you all that is necessary to understand here. Athena, Parthenos, the blue-eyed, the Sophia Perennis, the soul of chivalry, the angelic woman sung by the Minnesänger or the still novel, still in the Middle Ages, right? Athena who ascends to the immutable dwelling of the mortals, a dwelling that stands firmly established, everlasting, never shaken by any gusts of wind that might unsettle it, never drenched by rains that could soak its foundations, never blanketed by snows that might cover its expanse. Instead, the boundless ether, the aether of the Proto-Indo-Europeans coming from Ide to burn shine, as we've seen before, stretching out in perpetual serenity, wholly unmarred by clouds, traversed only by a pale beam of unwavering brilliance, the heavenly maiden par excellence, right? The one that doesn't blink when she has to slaughter and that rewards instead only the true divinizing hero, the Virgin Athena. This Olympian daylight signifies nothing less than the instantiation of order in its most exalted and perfect form. Athena, in this sense, spearhead, the vanguard of the gods. Zeus, whose name obviously comes from the Dievus Pater, Sky Father, embodied this order as an authoritative dominion that carried within itself an innate and utterly unassailable potency, a conception that would radiate onward to the Roman version of the Deus Pater, or Jupiter, in fact, illuminating entire epochs well beyond the confines of classical antiquity. We talked about the noumena, the initial, properly foundational ritual relation existing between hero and god, right? So this is very different from the sort of superstition vision of say, a god asked for help simply, as mostly, for example, I know the peasantry would have believed, and or at least entrusting its destiny to the leaders, to the senators, to the nobility, right? Nor there is a remote and despotic abstraction of some, again, other superstitious nature of some god that, forces just simply to submission or to an arbitrary, capricious will, right? It's very subtle at a point. It's actually all very clear, very simple to explain this, but the way people today, after 3,000 years, tend to see this and report themselves to the divinity. Just yesterday's video was sort of tackling exactly this topic, in as much as you find people who still think that, again, 3,000 years haven't passed first, and that in this sense they have no issue in relating themselves with any divinity, and that especially tend to separate into sort of different eras in the world with sort of different ideas of God, without realizing that what changes at most is the relation of mankind to God, not God by definition, according to the doctrine of being and becoming, the doctrine of the two natures, right? Also making up fantasy ways in which you should relate to God without even understanding what it is. And that's probably, the greatest issue of the current times. Because we knew, as a matter of fact, after just very few generations ago, what this connection, at least there was a part of society that understood what this connection was about, and already, still the aforementioned peasants still in the land did not simply invoke, in fact, God in a supine fashion, in a merely fatalistic fashion. They knew that they could participate to a great endeavor to attempt to restore divine unity on earth. Right, and that video about Indo-European order as consciousness is very much deeply tied with that. Now, Apollo manifested a complementary dimension of that same order, right? And even here there are different instantiation of the hero historically, that in this sense is not merely what is a hero and what is a god to an extent, right? If you're looking at any other being other than God, Godfather, as mere hypothesis, it may be, especially in a video like this that is exalting, of course, in the Olympian concept, difficult not to see a principle of attempt to return or to start. Apollo is the rebooting, right? Apollo is the starter of the new era, and it's in this sense deeply connected with Athena as his sister, as they represent, as we've seen now, slightly, or not even slightly, but significantly different concepts of a unitary world, though. Apollo manifested the intellectual illumination that makes, for example, artistic creation possible. And of course, art is deeply divinely inspired. And as if you have an idea of Platonic philosophy and conception of art, regardless of the fact that Plato already came late, despite being a traditionalist, regarding sort of this older spirituality of half of a millennium before his times. Naturally, there's much of it in it. This goes along with the solar translucence that confers physical vitality and ritual catharsis at the same time. This informs both Greek statuary art and religious rite, given that essentially all was one, with that he who achieves divinity is by exercising the rite, in this sense, the principle of transfiguration. This, as if you read it also in the Bible, just like transfiguration had to appear. This is the same burning light, the aureola that you see, the halo, right, of gold, that is the same Apollonian one, as a matter of fact. Although etymological speculations continue to posit a non-Indo-European provenance for Apollo's name, potentially affiliated with Illyrian forms such as, that in any case would be connected with the Indo-European root, if it is such as Aplo or Aplos, and resonating even with the Nordic alpha, as a matter of fact, which in fact comes from the Proto-Germanic alpha, which means strength, denoting in this sense, if as is likely the case, the Indo-European root is confirmed, raw physical strength, right? A meaning that would be particularly apt given Apollo's preeminent status as the Doric deity par excellence amid the convergent migrations of Doric and Illyrian peoples. As a matter of fact, the Romans will top the doctrine of incarnation, but Apollo in principle was exactly the same. And again, because we are better documented for different cultures, different times, different stages of development, so it's all a bit different for all the various Indo-European branches. That's why it's necessary to confront them. But beauty as a moral value, as a matter of fact, in perfection, in this virginal rebooting of the world, as we've seen also with Athena, is necessary. This is the golden dawn, the golden spring and stock, right, of the Doric invaders. Regarding the etymology of Apollo, the paramount consideration in the field of comparative religion remains substantially the substantive religiosanic content rather than the merely nominal provenance. In other words, nobody cares even about the strictly sort of linguistic root. It's how these peoples, that in any case spoke an Indo-European language, eventually maintain as a core tenet of their spiritual beliefs. The Doric Artemis, right? This is tricky because many people don't immediately think of Artemis as a majorly important Olympian goddess. I mean, there are many gods in the Olympus. So Artemis is important, escapingly attractive, connected with the moon, with the forests, with the darkness as well, would be the Latin Diana. We actually talked just recently, as a matter of fact, about the actual meaning of the lunar function in Indo-Europeistics, especially in my last video about the sacred wheel upholding the turning heavens around the unmoving center, not just because the moon is bright as a reflection of the sun, but because she is the light in the darkness, right? And essentially the properly transfigured lunar and therefore feminine element that shines in the sky. So Athena comes straight, that doesn't need transfiguration. She comes straight out of Zeus with no other trait but this martial vigor of implacable coldness and stoic imperturbability in front of any slaughter of infinite amounts of people. The goddess of war, and radically and escalatorily superior to anything that the warriorism in Ares can present. Artemis is herself the moon, and as such, she's something completely different, and yet achieving that Olympian divinity that the same moon, in fact, acquires because of the sun's light, right? Artemis, also, for those who know Celtic, this is very easy, comes either from, we don't know exactly where the term, once again, comes from. It may be from a pre-Hellenic substrate as well. However, it's a composite term, possibly containing the very art, which, as you know, like the Artos Kingas, for example, is the bear, and the warrior bear, as a matter of fact. She, after all, lives in the forest. There is this chthonic element to that, and the idea of the war bands, as a matter of fact, of the early conquerors, maybe passing by probably the forested Olympus foothills, would need to, in fact, by ritual hunting, confront ferocious beasts. There were still lions in southern Europe at the time of Augustus, freely in the countryside, as a matter of fact. And in this case, it's a bear, so it's been something different. And bearing, by the way, a root that is very Nordic, if that were the case, because my personal surname actually comes from that, right? And it's beautiful, I think. And in that case, it's at least bear because it's very Germanic, and that's the root in my case. But here, art would therefore speak of an animal that, bears are also present in southern Europe, but in general has this also Nordic profile to a degree, and refers to an animal that is not, for example, the fawn, the deer, that is mostly associated with Artemis in iconography, in the mythology. And that would also have, we talk about the deer in probably in the metaphysical understanding and probably in the metaphysical geography of the world of Indo-European migration, right? The deer meets, say, in the middle point where the achievement is accomplished. Delphi, if you want, but probably the northern conqueror that descends from the north and the sees the deer as the spoliopema coming from the south, and in the myth of the world, ideally in Rome, the sacrifice of the purest blood is accomplished. That's also why, by the way, the deer is notoriously a Christian symbol in the same way, in the same sacrificial sense. Artemis's etymology may also be unrelated, telling the truth. In any case, visualized as a youthful huntress of austere athleticism, which is not merely some purely feminine element, and in this sense also pronounced northern pallor in mythology, stands in stark and absolute antithesis, in fact, to the polymorphous Ephesian Artemis, who was adorned, because of course there were many hunting goddesses, huntresses. The Ephesian one, more oriental, more Pelasgian if you want, was adorned with, famous enough, you've seen her very time. It's also the later Kubala. We talked about her in the video about, in fact, the literally the proletarian chthonic bias of Marius's legionaries that for political reasons was used as a tool. An Ephesian Artemis adorned with multitudinous breasts that comes straight out of the general model and the sort of exasperation of the older prehistoric Venuses, symbolizing boundless fecundity, which is very much needed, as we explained at the beginning, in the hierarchy of power. This Artemis is something else, right? Beneath an inherited appellation that was the same in both cases, because, again, the Hellenic so-called pantheon definitely inherits a massive amount of, Pelasgian elements. We'll talk about those too at some point. The Doric overlay at this point in history had sculpted a profoundly Indo-European archetype characterized by reticent vigor and septentrional restraint. Analogous divergences appear even within the later Christian iconography, for example, where the Magna Mater interpretation of Maria, as found in the devotional complex at Pompeii, contrasts sharply with the ethereal Virgin extolled by Bernard of Clairvaux in the Gothic North. Not merely a superficial variance between the blonde maiden of northern illuminated manuscripts and his swarthy Theotokos of the Byzantine cult, but a fundamental schism within the otherwise sort of straightforwardly necessary Catholic understanding of who this woman is and what function she has, that separates sort of the more oriental rite from the disciplined worship of the Orthia, from hair straight, upright at Sparta, right? A cult that had been imposed through Doric conquest. This is incredibly important, and again, it repeats itself because this Pelagian substratum is very strong in Mediterranean, but is routinely reconquered, repossessed, retransfigured by European civilization in the functional role of the Great Mother that is necessary in order to birth, in fact, God himself. Being bull of your mother, this was a concept that actually emerges from, and we'll talk about this at some point better, also in the relation between the sexes, the licity of, say, royal faculty only after having achieved the victory. For example, over this woman of the forest that Artemis, in a sense, fully represents, Think about the Latin myth of the Rex Nemorensis, right? And the connection, of course, of the forest with the most feminine chthonic element that, however, is possessed and transfigured. And this is also true in what we were saying before as far as the war bands within it and the secrets that they can get from that. It's a bit like, I don't know, when Parsifal emerges from the forest because he sees these knights, these angels who killed everything they touched, his mother said, and his mother dies as he leaves her from there. So the mother is omnipresent, and also in the Western forms of art, for example, during the Middle Ages, is again the perennial Sophie and the angelic woman par excellence. That is Victoria herself, right? And this is obviously sublimating, particularly in the Holy Roman imperial tradition. The quintessence of any religious paradigm inheres in its distinctive mode of apprehending the divine. An objective vision, wherein the absolute in the moment of its epiphany assumes concrete particularity and imprints itself as imago within the percipient subject by means of an intuitio intellectualis, precisely in that place where the gods exist as graded emanations from the ontological plenum. It's only through this lens, through this litmus test, that we can appreciate the spiritual identity of a people, and we can study Indo-European religion in a diachronic and comparative way, right? The absolute is metaphysical. The various degrees, the hypostatic instantiations, are something else, that we are ourselves and we live in a lower nature that is merely an hologram of the perennial one. There are also different ways to the one. One can be a visionary apprehension, another can be believing, right? Credence, as opposed to seeing, right? They entwine. And the beauty of the Olympian pantheon lays exactly in this depth of sort of introspective capacity. The septentrional psyche of the Indo-European lineage achieved its most unadulterated and purest metaphysical self-understanding. That's why we use Hellenic mythology in psychoanalysis, for example. It all stems from the same originary mode that you can find, as a matter of fact, studying, for example, through our series, the wall of Indo-European religion. For example, the triad formed by Eusebeia from the Proto-Indo-European good plus su, that is good, and that is to place, to revere. That is pious rationality in reverence at the same time. That is to say, a full understanding that makes you partake with heart and soul, so to say. The second element of the triad, we see here, by the way, the Holy Trinity representing itself again. The eidos, which comes from the Proto-Indo-European heid, which means shame, but respect in particular. So the decorous restraint one feels before sacral presences. And third, the sophrosyne, coming from the Proto-Indo-European sev, which means safe, and dread, to hold, right? The courageous moderation that harmonizes all impulses, illuminating the Olympian fate as an intrinsically and unmistakably European dispensation. This triad, interestingly enough, finds radically strong parallelisms with the concept we outlined in the Indo-European heaven from Virgil's work, the Augustan vision of the paradise. Well, you realize in this Hellenic triad, everything is transfigured. There isn't even properly a difference if you look at that, because this is how the Greeks conceived the purest form in absolute terms. And so in the Virgilian heaven, you see even sheep having golden or purpureal wool, for example. Even the theos, the most chthonic element, being golden, all flabby, so to say, and in a perennial understanding. So it was incredibly strong among the Southern European cultures for an incredibly long time, well after the full settlement of the Indo-European in fact, migrations. The concept of the absolute, of the most celestially clear understanding. This is something you're not really taught in school, that you're not really presented, that was the actual belief, that the establishment that took over the world with Alexander, with Augustus, truly had exclusively this in mind. The celestial assembly of gods reflected the same internal calibration, extending virile attributes even to its feminine constituents. We've seen it with Artemis, that is, say, institutionally at that point an Olympian deity. Then there are some Pelasgian ones that were, however, transfigured, and which one but the mother, the great mother herself, Hera, that whose name comes from either the Proto-Indo-European care, which means to grow, so like, which is likely, by the way, so you see even that there are some pre-Indo-European figures archetypally that, of course, acquire Indo-European names, so that's even not just a criterion per se, but it shows the universal, all-encompassing system, or again, whichever other pre-Hellenic source. Hera is the embodiment of sanctified matrimony and familial stability. She is already the wife of Zeus. She's already taken, subordinated to her husband. Artemis, in her chaste, agile, and youthful form that we've seen before, like a teenager that is somehow, to be fully dignified by the heavenly grace, and Athena, the most splendid of all these female deities, that emerges fully panoplied from the cranial fissure of Zeus as the very incarnation of strategic intellect and audacious deliberation. Right? This is, again, radically important and in particularly connected at that point with the military host, with the sense that those who have to take over the world must be led by the transfigured soul, by the eternal principle of heavenly order, that Athena, with her weapons, and provocatorily so, as a feminine deity, as the most straightforward of Zeus's creation, leads the soul of the hero as itself, right? When you look at this picture we're outlining, you can realize that the Hellenic cults are the sort of quintessential religious ideation of European Geist, a conception that stands divergent from the paradigmatic formations of all other cultures, because we don't have an instantiation of this intellectually crystal clear and founded, and as much as we've seen, entirely coherent and properly not simply reconstructed, but self-descriptive mechanism in the other cultures. The other cultures at large, they're all sort of we can't collect the pieces from later, in part because either they were were swallowed by the sort of some of the pre-Indo-European substratum, like in India, and or I don't know, they began to write very late in time, like the Romans themselves. With the Greeks, we have a continuous stratification, where obviously we understand also for this time it's very difficult to reconstruct things, but that in proportion with the others is incredibly straightforward and more easily traceable, right? Superimposable with specific evidence that comes along across the millennia, right? And in fact, what strikes of Hellenic thought is that it remains perfectly consonant with everything that is authentically Hellenic in later philosophy, art, and politics. I mean, in the most sort of degenerate aspects of the classical Hellas and its further sort of, I don't know, Dionysian prevalence, this sort of re-Pelasgianization of the system, you realize, like in sources that can like Hesiodus, like they are very famous and that talk about the origins, that even within the Pelasgian substratum, there is a core of, and very clearly identifiable core of Hellenic Dorian affirmation and domination that stands, by the way, imperishably before humanity is something enduringly real. When you look at Hellenic philosophy, art, or politics, this is something of the most single straightforward. I mean, Hellas was even fairly small as a country. It had a quite great expansion, but let's say it was, let's say, relatively punctiform. From other cultures, enormous ones, we struggle even extensionally to gather more information. Think about the Achaemenids, right? In comparison, like we know a disproportionately larger amount about ancient Hellas than we know about practically any other culture, even in later times from antiquity, in its spiritual foundation in particular. So the very persistence of Zeus, Apollo, Athena, and Artemis in contemplative elevation, even today, attests their veridicality, right? They assert to the, just like the Olympus, the standard term also for identifying other Indo-European branches, cultures in many ways. The magic sort of cornerstone of Indo-Europeistics, in particular for antiquity, is fundamentally, the Hellenic world, the Vedas, and Rome, all right? And linguistically as well, like the consonances between these three are radical, and they attest to, again, this sort of strongest affirmation. It will remain Olympian in nature, right? And also probably in its Apollonian, Uranian, light-based system, as opposed to, for example, other Indo-European peoples that lived a bit more in the fringe and in the shade, and sort of interiorized even that with some sort of darker, more reawakening kind of condition, naturally by relative degree, not categorically. So if you look at the ancient Germans, again, we get much less of this light, but we know that in the foundational principle was pretty much strongly out there, right? And some concepts are even preserved in its more primitively voracious dimension. That happens also partly with Rome. In fact, with the Greeks, the paradox is that all this information that we have is incredibly useful because, it's mandatory in this comparative diachronic method, is that we can get, extrapolate from it some core just by the sheer amount of information that we would do the unthinkable just to have for the other cultures, about which we know some important lot, just to draw also the broader picture in a unitary and originary sense for all of them. This is incredibly important. When you look at the Olympians, you realize that they encountered the seeker anew, wholly beyond the strictures of merely prosaic or historical confinement. We can almost palpate properly the aura of the Hellenic mythology. The monarchs of the Doric Achaean epoch reflected this mentality. They had for themselves epithets such as Diotrephes, that literally, as we've seen also in the video about the Dorians, comes from Dios, the sky, and Drep, which means to nourish, right? So they were essentially, as a metaphysical instantiation of divinity, nurtured by heaven. The same goes for the name Diogenes, which are attributed, again, in origin, these names that eventually were banalized later on. When statues were erected for heroes, people were deified just because they had died, right? In classical Hellas. But originally, these were names of kings, of sacred rulers. Diogenes comes from Dies, and gen, that obviously means to be born, right? So if you look at the genealogies of all the great heroes of this period, realize that they came straight from Zeus, and it is explicitly reconstructible, right? And this was obviously the historical and metaphysical affiliation from divinity. So they were nurture generated by Zeus himself, and thus underscoring their theogenic legitimacy. Delphi, acclaimed throughout the Hellenic world as the omphalos, as we said before, the navel of the terrestrial sphere, functioned as the axial locus of Doric cultural hegemony. This was the place from which this divine power irradiated all around on Hellas. Ritual intercourse with divinity in this milieu deliberately eschewed all emotional effusion. The Olympian essence, best expressed by Athena, grounded itself in a contractual reciprocity of death, right? It wasn't a matter of pathos. It wasn't something connected with some Dionysian orgy. Ideally, like, we should actually open a parenthesis for that, because there was always some sort of this shamanic reactivation necessary in the cults also of the war. But when you think about classical Greece, you don't think, we've seen it in the videos about the Hellenic hoplites and so on, that the phratries, the general organizations of the polis, of the same civic body, were fundamentally stemming from war bands, right? And probably the idea of being a citizen in arms wasn't being about, anybody else. It was a symbol of freedom and thus of nobility, hence of divinity, that gradually again faded. But when you look at Sparta, you realize that they had a much deeper, I will see it now better, say, primigenial awareness about their identity that they tried to preserve as much as possible in the wake of probably divine kingship. By the way, only in Hellas, only sovereigns were permitted to officiate at the great sacrificial immolations. Here we're looking a bit earlier, where of course kings were, present. They were still tyrants by the time of the Achaemenid invasion of Hellas, and it was actually the more straightforward way of ruling a polis. Right? Then, of course, Athens and Sparta were sort of a bit different, but they became the paradigm of this whole, and that's also where we know most of the entire deals, religiously speaking. So kings in Hellenic tradition monopolized the sacerdotal prerogative. Female existence transpired entirely devoid of juridical autonomy, famously enough in Hellenic law, across the whole lifespan of the woman, with the kurios, so the lord, which comes from the Proto-Indo-European ku, which means to swell, and authority, so the augmenting nature, properly, of lordship, right, the one emanating from God himself, hence, the same kurios, Lord, Christos, etc. First, the father and subsequently the spouse, exercising perpetual guardianship on the woman. Interestingly, and this was the case also, I don't know, look in Germanic law, or also initially like the Roman law. This was kind of obvious, like, woman was essentially not juridical autonomous in Indo-European societies. If anything, she wasn't independent. And there was a degree of autonomy in the Germanic and Roman tradition, but the woman herself could not legally decide from an autonomous point of view. She needed always a guardian, and that was always the case. In Hellas, actually, you see some of the most rigidly sort of regulated forms of this, notoriously. Think about the Achaea, the fact that the women were relegated to the Okeia, that they did not probably have any role, even just visually speaking, in public authority, in public life. Apollo, the quintessential Doric luminary, who was designated, in fact, as Phoebos, so from Be, to shine, and the aforementioned Apollon, as the immaculate and effulgent one in this literal sense, because it's virginal and fire at the same time, appeared also as such as the aureate divinity who presided over a primordial golden age. Right? That was what Apollo was connected with, the rebooting of divine power, the regeneration of that, the sacred fire itself, right? Just like also in the Vedic tradition, in the Roman Vesta, that's the living fire, right? And his Hyperborean providence evoked a septentrional purity to the highest order. There's a lot of iconographic symbolism connected with that. Think about the swan, right? The migratory birds coming from the north. This was very much out there, straightforwardly in Hellenic tradition in Rome. Think about this again, sea peoples, ships, like with their prows, like mimicking these birds of the north coming from the perennial sea, the Hyperborean one and the Olympian one in that sense, emerging literally, again, as we just explained, properly swelling with authority as the lords, the conquerors, all right, to mold the world in their own image, inordinate as it had happened in Hellas from the Omphon of Delphi. The heroic archetype denoted unequivocal and absolute allegiance to the Olympian regimen in perpetual antagonism to everything that belonged to the Titanic substratum. The Pelasgian forces of the netherworld that had been crushed, and as you know, in mythology, destroyed by the gods, a bit like the Aesir, in the Germanic, I mean, the same foundational affirmation echoing the Indo-European conquest. And it found its crystalline articulation throughout the entire Hellenic mythic corpus. And it's a sanctioning one. It's a bit like, the Byzantine almost sclerosis of that we establish a perfect world. There can't be anything outside of that, right? This is most saliently evident in the Doric Heracles, as we said at the beginning. Heracles himself, like etymologically, comes from hing, which means fire, and kleros, which means glory. It's obviously connected with the proceeding of this divine power from heaven to earthly accomplishment, and re-accomplishment of heaven in Heracles' myth. Paralleling the exploit of Theseus against the Minotaur, or Bellerophontes, from the Proto-Indo-European bell to strike and Ghent to kill, which is a hell of a name, not really much space to imagination there, against the Chimera, from Gay, which means winter, and Mor, which means dark, and so the symbol so potently, sort of chtonically tempered, at least barren. As I mentioned, again, the Chimera is very important. It is a symbol of what cannot be in two places. It's a mix of so many different things that do not work anymore. All right, so it figures in this picture, as well as you were saying before. You have other models like Achilles, for example, that comes from Hic sharp, and the etymology is sort of connected also with those whose people's gonna weep, fundamentally. When you look at this sort of figure in the strife before Troy, you realize that he embodies, in that sense, also a later heroic but fallimentary model. So you have the whole range, the whole spectrum, the whole stratification of this symbolism. You don't have much of this in other. Surely at the time, all those other cultures had this different ventail of figures, but we sort of get the most straightforward to a degree. But it is true that there was something also more totalizing about ours, more straightforward. Heracles waged inexorable campaigns against the Amazons, which literally means without breast in the pre-Greek, at least we think that this is the etymology, culminating in their complete extirpation, whereas the Lydian variant of the myth shows Heracles succumbing for a time to the dominion of Omphale, which also means navel, but in a effeminate subjugation. So the idea that there is a temporary ensnaring, a bit like the Tannhäuser we talked about, the German monarchs slumbering in the chthonic mountainous dimension. There is also the Venus netherworld that can, instead, in the Odyssey you have sort of beautiful depiction of that, something that can temporarily confuse even the most Apollonian of heroes. And the Doric iteration presents Heracles, however, as an uncompromising misogynist. Hera, notoriously in her telluric aspect as chthonic consort, harbored in her intimate, implacable enmity towards Heracles from the very moment of his nativity, and dispatched serpents to his infancy, serpents which he notoriously throttled forthwith with his infant hands. His lifelong contest with her yielded no decisive victory on either side, yet inflicted real wounds upon the goddess herself, culminating in the appropriation of her sole progeny Hebe from the Proto-Indo-European Yun, which means youth, right? The eternal, in fact, Ephebe, who symbolizes unaging vitality. The archetype behind this is quite important. From one side, you have Heracles finally sort of not just fulfilling his fatigues, sort of his efforts in a cosmic plenitude, the 12th and so on. That there's a lot of numerological reference there. But importantly enough, even though he clashes against Hera, his point is not to destroy her. The point in the myth is him to surpass that gynecocratic influence and achieving divinity within still a sphere that again is seen as dominated by Zeus as a whole. That is the one who, in fact, through divine grace, makes Heracles, a constellation. Whereas the appropriation of Hebe, Hercules' wife, symbolizes in this sense the unlocking of the maternal overprotection, and also in that sense the fertilization of the tyrannic queen, right, towards all other women, the younger ones, the ones that in this sense are dominated by that. There is all an archetype. It's just like, think about Snow White. The tale is literally the same thing, in at least, well, not like with Hercules here, but in the archetypal principle. And so Hercules also, and he actually pays for that, as you know, is the myth, because basically betrayed by. But the interesting aspect is that Hebe is also a purely divine wife, because she's actually the daughter of Zeus and Hera as well. And so there is in Hercules, again, the greatest sense of Olympian achievement all around in a sort of cosmic sense, right? Heracles, in this sense, carries an Apollonian dimension because he reboots the cycle of the world. He refertilizes Hebe, as a matter of fact, all right? Apollo's own Genesis had encountered repeated abstraction by Hera. So hence the parallelism with the same Apollonian principle. In fact, Hera had been abetted by Ares in martial fury and deploying Python as assassin as a consequence. And that's when Apollo slaughters Python. So you can see in Hercules, you see this gradual, this Siegfried sort of repetition in Hellenic tradition. There are different strata that also degrade this hero, like from god to mortal, as a matter of fact. If you reach Achilles, with Hercules as actually something balancedly in between, and you have the same dynamic. The virile element that is attemptively threatened, mortally threatened by the Great Mother, by the Gaia-Mater, and also the bride of the sky of the Godfather, which is also a beautiful way of seeing like the encompassing natural world is still part of your divine mission to tame the cosmos. As a potential, again, as a constant threat, as something you have to develop your muscles with. And this is exactly what essentially Hercules in particular achieves. But Apollo in principle was essentially suffering the same issue. Apollo also fights with Hera's progeny Tatius under maternal edges, in the course of which the Hyperborean archer inflicts injury upon the goddess. Just as Ajax, that comes from the Proto-Indo-European Ai, which means vital force, had once affronted Aphrodite, Venus. As you know, Ajax also in his story does not end well, right? But in that sense, at that lower level, you see a bit like the aforementioned Tannhäuser, that there is especially in the Hellenic world, this constant that's probably the misogynistic and anti-gynecocratic attitude, which underscores the radical clash between a very strong Eastern Mediterranean Pelasgian dimension and the struggle that the best of the Indo-European conquerors had to carry out in order to subjugate, in fact, the most precious at that point in time, part of Europe. And hence the hyper-foundational need of crystallization, of affirmation, of subjugation, of conquest that is repeated in this myths that also, however, speak of, in fact, of an actual brutality in between. Aphrodite's name comes from the Proto-European Hebel, which means foam born, likely because, as you know, the birth of Venus happened from the waters, as also the beautiful painting by Botticelli reminds us, or also from a pre-Hellenic source at this point is the leitmotif, but we should be more straightforwardly, safe in stressing that the Indo-European term in any case is pretty eloquent in that sense. It matches with the entire mythology. This also in the American narrative. So, of course, again, in the Iliad, in the Odyssey, the relation with God is something much more complicated. And again, the same destiny of Achilles shows how much sort of already secular and modern that vision was, and how also even anti-Mycenaean in that regard that things were. Because likely the Mycenaean rulers were much more sort of monarchically divine in identity and more. So Achilles' end in hell is something pretty crude and brutal that goes in parallel, just like with the affirmation of this heavy infantry is crushing the great demigods and war chariot. Think about the Dendropan, it had incarnated again some utterly incredible model of warriorism. But remember, Athena crushes Ares, right? And Western civilization is founded in this sense of this collective robustness that is meant to augment, at least in principle, the entire world as it is conquered and assimilated. When the Indo-European tribes migrated westward in the Hellenic peninsula, or actually southeastward even to a degree, because we talk about this in the video about the Dorian migration, two fundamentally distinct facets demand careful discernment. The former aligns with the sacral permeation that is characteristic of old nascent grand traditions, evoking a cosmos that, as we've seen, is still saturated with the numinous. The latter adumbrates the terminal humanistic, profane, and rationalistic phase that prompts contemporary observers to anachronistically posit Hellas as the fons et origo of their own secular ethos. As we explained before, we celebrate Hellenic civilization mostly in the decadent phase of its existence, and we don't focus as much on its primordial footprint, right? This is what with these videos we are really looking at, because if you think about it, by the way, it's not like again, we just said it, the Hellenic world was heavily stratified, so there was an Hellenic identity of some sort already before this point, but we're talking a relatively short time. I mean, between this and the Persian Wars, that there is just half of a millennium, which in historical terms is not even that much, right? And that sort of, in the European way, was still fresh in spiritual terms. Now, the substratal Aegean Pelasgic layer that is part also of, again, a previous, again, in the European realm, we'll talk more about those peoples who had come to live in the world before. There is an idea of stratification coming from the various eras scanning. There was a golden age, then a silver one, and when you look at the red skin cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean, different Pelasgian figures like also the Minoans, etc., there is an idea that these peoples still were part of those who descended from the Atlantean collapse, right? And that there was something more primigenial, same in itself, in other parts of Europe that eventually are the ones who came. Think about the Nordic battle axe that came to reinvigorate the system. We'll talk more about this stuff because it basically contrasts, at least in a mythological sense, with the idea that we have of Indo-European migrations. Because the point is, okay, everybody was kind of Yamnaya, and then what happened? That was accorded where filiation in that sense, and then everything that the Indo-European thing happened like that. But say before that is overwhelmingly difficult to theorize anything that we can't fully confirm. And tradition actually tells us something different, or at least something that comes before that regarding the origin of these figures. And when you look at this Aegean Pelasgian substratum, as we explained before, and also in the video about the Indo-European Urfolk, we've seen that it was predominantly Demetrian, right? From Ge-Meter, which also in Proto-Indo-European comes as the Earth Mother, right? Mother Earth. At least probably also in orientation. There were also some chthonic, demonic, sort of nether elements manifested, for example, in subterranean fire rites or aquatic divinities that mix against some reminiscences of the older era of mankind. And in diametric opposition to this, we have this authentically Hellenic configuration that crystallized through the incursive Achaean and later Doric phyla that is distinguished by the Homeric Olympian ethos by the veneration of the Hyperborean Apollo. And this stands for both as the glue that kept together the war bands that took over multiple waves, the Hellenic Peninsula, and that sense of higher love and vigor and participation to divine power that we illustrated before. Just to make an example, the etymology of Achaioi comes from hek, which means sharp or pointed, and the Dorians, from doru, which is spear, wood. So I don't think there is also in here much room for imagination. It's a bit like saying, where does probably the concept of the Germans come from? What is the spear? What is the Geyer? What is Gungnir as well? This primigenial sense of the spear, also the javelin thrown, is very much alive. Then you think about Krishna and Arjuna and the sort of the ultimate target of the hero. It's clearly evident. Its presence also in geometric painting. We've seen it well in the video about the Dorian physiognomy, so to say. And when you look at the Hyperborean Apollo, his triumphant engagement with Python, whose body was interred beneath the new Apollonian shrine at Delphi. That's why the rite had to be reperformed. Of course, the spirit was still there in a totemic, inferic sense, thereby, however, in the process, displacing what was the prior oracular dominion of Gaia, that had, in fact, there a shrine, a sanctuary. The Earth Mother herself, conjoined, by the way, with other mastodontic figure that in Hellenic mythology is also Zeus's brother, as a matter of fact, the Atlantic Pelasgic Poseidon, that is most eminently chthonic in nature. And again, there are lots of compenetrations. Think about the Pegasus in the Hellenic symbolism, and the duality of the heavenly and the sort of telluric meaning of the horse. We talked about this in different videos about our sort of prehistory of knighthood, or at this point actually also history of knighthood. By the way, Poseidon comes from the Proto-Indo-European potis, which means lord, and Denu, which means river, which I think is very powerful as a concept and does not even necessarily speak of the sea per se. But it may have been, in fact, a term coming from the more continental idea of the waters, of the rivers, of the continent, the interland. In any case, Poseidon, in this sort of early phases, really has a role as a hydric demon, right? Encapsulating at that point with the sort of dignification by the European conquest, a bifold signification. Because this was a male deity, but still sort of present in a chthonic motherly womb of the earth. On the one hand, in fact, you find metaphysical transvaluation whereby the Uranic luminosity supplanted the telluric obscurity. And on the other, a historical ethnic confrontation between bearers of celestial cultus and adherents of subterranean worship that at some point had also to live together during the conquest. And these deities are quite eloquently sort of underscoring this continuity, because had there been just there could have not been an erasure, as we've seen, of the chthonic element. But this is very participative. Poseidon is next to Zeus, and they are almost like ruling two different spheres of the world, and the Pluton is within, is still essentially living underneath, right, the Apollonian temple at Delphi. As we've seen in the video about the Dorian migrations, ethnocultural affinities sustain broad parallels between Achaeans and Dorians on one side, and some other Indo-European peoples from the north aggregating among the Celts, the Germanic tribes, the Scandinavians, as well as the Vedic Arya, right? Evidenced in shared institutional patterns, martial ethos, and civilizational typology. Even in that primordial sense, in a closer fashion. Like for Rome, we see things as they had already happened, and because we have less documentation. But had we studied that in the origin, we would probably be that there are some, for example, striking parallels. I mean, even in the later documentation between the Vedas and the Romans, which is really something. Well, the Dorian migration has a lot to do also with the Celto-Germanic, probably also Nordic sphere in a sense. And again, this was shared more or less by the entire Europeans, as far as these waves of peoples historically would continue. I mean, what we said before regarding the settlements of the Alains and the Italics is because later, there would be waves of Celts and Germanics, but fundamentally the ethnic landscape had been historically drawn with those millennia before Christ remain fundamentally unaltered in these various regions, right? But the spiritual correspondences are overwhelmingly resonating. And it's sort of weird how we inwardly look at this as more like the separations between the Indo-European branches, as opposed to the fact that as Europeans were swelling really across the entire board, the entire continent and beyond, in a way that has not been stressed enough. The same Hellenic colonization is a continuation. There is no really fracture if you look at it with the Sea People's raids, right? The antagonistic polarities that we described in the Hellenic world between a Uranian and a chthonic dimension crystallized in aesthetic and symbolic registers as well. We wouldn't have Greek art without that kind of tension. The Doric modality is austere linear rectitude, its geometric solar lucidity, its essential distillation, all evincing emancipatory potency and primordial formality, as cosmos, that we have learned in the video about Indo-European consciousness, is the Hellenic way to order, right? In fact, the Proto-Indo-European root word is kens, which means to order, but also to adorn, really, so to augment in a divine sense. And they incarnate, arrayed in direct opposition against the Cretan Minoan proclivity, hence also the Minotaur slain by the Zeus, for tumultuous organicity and profuse zoomorphic, phytomorphic ornamentation. Again, just like later Hellenic art, the Cretan Minoan art is very beautiful to see, but spiritually speaking, we're just looking at a piece of stone or something, and this is against the eye of providence kind of based spirituality of the earlier conquerors, and in this sense have kind of less than these pre-conquered peoples, but also were able essentially to tame and dominate them. With, again, enormous contributions from the latter, especially in the Hellenic case. The resplendent Olympian iconographies, counterpoised to legacies of Ophidian deities, anthroposerpentine hybrids, asinine-headed demons, Ebon equestrian goddesses, in esoteric venerations of hypogel flames or thalassic potencies. In other words, this is also what the same conquerors described in Hellenic sort of culture, literature later, when things were written down, as an aberration of nature, like the Sphinx, the Chimera, So all this disorderly world was reunited by a divine insight, which was achieved because if you look at the model that the Greeks imposed with the polis and with all the sort of broader organization this entailed, it was really unique in its uniformity. Even though, of course, it was different within itself to a degree, but it was something really that we study mostly how it happened. It's an institutional process. It's politics, or maybe, I don't know, we have to explain socioeconomical. This straightforwardly, explicitly comes from a very specific spiritual understanding and worldview typical of the European identity coming from the Indo-European conquests of the millennia before Christ. Primordial Hellas encompassed both Olympian and heroic motives in this symbiotic and tense relationship at the same time. Heroes as demi-divine entities who partook of Olympian perpetuity transcended ordinary anthropic transience. The Doric Achaean exemplar were not predicated on consanguineous divine filiation that would entail inherent hyper-anthropism, derived its definition instead from performative valor. Think about this when you think it's mostly about, zoological determinism or archaeogenetic kind of, materialism. This is pure divine transcendence and transfiguration out of merit of virtue of works. This is a purely Catholic tradition. The ontology of the hero was wholly epic in the Hellenic world. It was impervious to this sort of this meridional luminisms, ecstatic dissolutions, or to the regressive matricial envelopments. When you look at Nika, victory herself, from the Indo-European naik, which means to conquer, the very personification of triumph. Nike laureled the Doric Heracles within the Olympian precinct, the divine nature. This was a sanctuary of unalloyed masculinity that was fortified against every Titanic incursion. It's the Asgard, right? The Hellenic paragon repudiated, for example, Prometheus, which comes from prophore, so essentially plus meant to think, really, and that looks at things in the negatively, in the sense, technological, secularized mentality. Prometheus was perceived as Zeus's subjugated adversary, as the emblem of Pelasgic recalcitrance. He, after all, served the fourth estate with this technological, mean of destruction it could not handle, right? And so humanity cannot handle the power that it's received. There is even in we'll talk about Prometheus also in other videos. There is a partial redemption to that because it's not completely out of merit, but right, it ends as it not too well, at least because you may never know which one sort of branch would have prevailed or is aligned with this or that time in history. We'll talk, if anything, about this in another time. Probably the Hellenic paragon instead was founded on the exaltation of the anti-gynecocratic Heraclean model that systematically liquidated the entire Titanic residue, annihilating Amazonian matriarchies, lacerating the Magna Mater herself, procuring the Hesperidian, which stands for Hesper in the European evening west. There's a deep and important meaning of that. We've seen it also in the Virgilian heaven. That's the divine and royal garden of the Rex Nemorensis, to say the Roman way, where Heracles, in fact, enters. And in fact, Heracles is also connected with some aspects of Latium, of the west, of the Roman tradition. As you know, Heracles gets the Auric poems through Dracontine conquest. Exonerating Atlas was, it stems from the root to bear. And so, that he held the axis of the world and heralded the story. And again, that connects with the myth of Atlantis. We'll talk about it at some point. By, in fact, temporarily assuming the axial burden, Heracles does that, in fact, not as a castigation of the self, but as probationary ordeal. Hence also the self-sacrifice, but as the greatest honor, by getting probably the golden apple, and ultimately transiting by way of the purifying fire, in fact, from terrestrial finitude to celestial apotheosis. You had in Heracles the most straightforwardly sort of correct Catholic view of the entire universe. And that's why this is the most sort of clearly, unequivocally outlined divine accomplishment in Hellenic mythology. Deities who underwent cyclic passion, mortality, and vegetal resurrection, or those, yesterday we were talking about, in that sense, reincarnation, which is definitely not a very Indo-European thing, or those who dramatize the fractured soul's desertive anguish, in other words, exemplifying the being, the becoming, not the being, remained utterly alien to this autochthonous Hellenic soteriology. In other words, if you were not part of heaven yourself, of the Olympus, you were just in the lower realm, and you could not enter, obviously not. Now, ethnic stratification delineates three distinct tiers: vestigious, wholly extraneous to the northern, western Atlantic Indo-European cycles. Palo-Indo-European ramifications had been propelled by the archaic Mediterranean basin and had subsequently devolved within Pelasgic cultural matrices, and the properly Hellenic northern-western influxes of comparatively recent descent. In this triadic schema that corresponds to the Holy Trinity, in fact, likely informs the Spartan political and social division, the traditional doctrine of the cases, as a matter of fact. The Spartiates, from Spartoi, which means sown men, from probably spare to sow, which was understood to have been done with a spear, by the way. And there's beautiful also Hellenic poems about the Celts doing the same, because that's how they ruled the land anyway, hence the higher status of the Spartiati. Then the perioikoi, famously enough. So peri stands for around, so someone who leaves the fringe. Veik is the settle, hence the composite name. And the helotes, the helotes. It's a pre-Hellenic word, or it comes from se, which means to bind, so meaning that they were actually depending, that were essentially slaves, but in this sense very much somebody's possession specifically. So differently from the allies, the perioikoi, with the traditional tripartite rather than quadripartite schema explicable through a warrior aristocracy that was concurrently sacral, as instantiated in the Heraclids. For example, the Heraclidae, these were the Spartan families of rulers. Obviously, this meant that they descended from Heracles himself. The Geleontes clan, this lineage that stems from Gel, in the Proto-Indo-European root to shine, so quite evidently connected with the heavenly dimension. So the radiant ones, just like Apollo, would trace this and would trace symbolic patrimony to Zeus Geleon, as a matter of fact. And so everything stemmed from, obviously, the god Father. Now, despite the frequent animus of Hellenic historiographers towards the Pelasgoi that are often associated with this Levantine dimension, the Egypto-Syriac observances, and there is no doubt that, of course, the Eastern Mediterranean had massive influxes on the same Hellenic culture, as we well know. Contemporary scholarship corroborates the profound alterity of the Achaeans vis-a-vis antecedent Pelasgic infrastructures, while simultaneously affirming the fundamental congruence of Achaean Doric culture with the northern peoples' constellations that include even the Vedas, as we've seen, that have striking parallelisms with the Hellenes. And so, if you look at the Pelasgic cosmos coming before that, you realize it had contemplated the existence of a god, say, of a heavenly god, let's say better, because, again, the Europeans had already been around. And so before the Achaeans had taken over with the Mycenaeans, and obviously even before the Dorians, as a consequence, there had been contacts that had produced in this, also at some Eastern Mediterranean context, the awareness of a mortal as well as hypogel Zeus. In other words, these Pelasgians had thought that they could crush and destroy these heavenly conquerors, that these conquerors inspiring themselves to a heavenly dimension by killing them, showing them that their worldview was winning, that Mother Earth won anyway, that you went in the netherworld. And that's all, after that, that's also a bit what Achilles himself essentially achieved in a more detached and more prosaic way. In fact, I don't know, Heracles that really gets to heaven, and for not talking of an Apollo. So you can see there the whole certification. And the Pelasgians had said, okay, well, basically we killed these guys. Imagine there was, I don't know, I think the European warband that came around and they took him down and they burned it, even as an insult, because they preferred cremation. Well, imagine, in this sense, a Pelasgian war dominated by the idea of an omnipotent nigra mater terra, just being Latin terms, a black Mother Earth, preponderant gynecocratic cults, which means officiated by priestesses and women that held positions of authority, of power. And that's where you find, in fact, the Pelasgian elements in the female deities that eventually are adopted by the Olympians, captured, tamed, possessed, right, and transfigured by the Olympians. Hera, Hestia. Hestia comes from Hes, which means heart in Proto-Indo-European, and Themis comes from the European day to place low, the Caritas that comes from car to rejoice, the Nereids from Neros, which is likely pre-Hellenic, culminating in the Demetrian lunar enigmas accompanied by gynecocratic ritual and mores. Think again about the enigma of the Sphinx and the victory of the Indo-European hero. By wit, by wisdom, right? These monsters, like the Minotaur, but the Titans, they're bigger in number. And that's what the symbol in that sense is, the spiritual superiority over the physical one, right? And surely there were connections with other Eastern countries. For example, the Sphinx itself, think about Egypt, right? So there was a devolutionary phase where, of course, waves of Levantine civilization had heavily informed Southeastern Europe at that point, and historically, like, there were very strong ties also with the older Bronze Age Mother Earth domination, the destruction. What is more or less today's Serbia, that at some point, well, the most advanced part of Europe that eventually was taken over by the Indo-Europeans with its tectonic, almost communistic settlement with promiscuity, sort of feministic vibe, and so on. Traces of this supplantation in Hellenic culture endure most vividly, for example, in Aeschylus' Orestes trilogy, as we pointed out before, particularly in the Eumenides, which means good mind in Proto-Indo-European, the celestial conclave that adjudicated Orestes' uxoricidal vendetta witnessed Apollo and Athena championing patriarchal jurisprudence against the nocturnal Erinys matrifocal retribution. I can't stress patriarchal enough, especially because Athena is involved. I mean, Apollo and Athena are the perfect blend. It's actually Athena that guides the hosts because of that necessity of rejuvenating or transfiguring the soul of the commander. So the host is based on this very specific feminine transcendence into divine plenitude. And so Apollo and Athena combine themselves by protecting Orestes during the night against the Erinys. By adducing Athena's cephalic parturition in contradistinction to the primordial partogenetic virgins that are, in this sense, inferior in practice in just replicating the simple earth sort of expansion, redevoration, and regurgitation at the same time, the possibility of paternity without maternity was promulgated. It's the same thing in Christianity when you realize that Christ birthed the same mother. This was, as I was saying before, a specific attribute of divine rulers in the past, being your own mother's father, right? And at the same time, he who ingravitates the mother. This is literally, I mean, if you look at the Immaculate Conception and what all sort of this meant in practical terms, it's not really some random misinterpretation of text. This is very debatable because, of course, that is the case. But if you think about it, if you're pregnant with God and you're essentially birthing your own son that is also your own father, this is literally it, all right, as well as your own husband in this sense, as the mother church is married with Christ. So reflect on this. It's a trinity, right? But back to the Eumenides, Orestes' acquittal inaugurated an innovative nomos, which is, as you know, the term for law that is actually already a bit of a, in the time in which the Eumenides were written down as a deterioration of the thuke, right? That was understood later as the fate, but was actually instead originally the heroes, and so God's will. I mean, the deified hero and God's will. So the nomos stand from distribute. It's the meaning of law, right? Ethos is custom. Deka is to show justice, and the serpentine-crowned chthonic sorority, a bit like the Medusa, the progeny of nux, that we have seen in the video about nu, right, and which means not just simply night, but metaphysically, spiritually, the negation of the self, and in this sense, emblems of the pre-Hellenic Ion bewailed the obsolescence of their ancien regime. So that's the change. Those are the Dorians who arrive and restore a divine order. The tribunal itself, that is eventually also provided with some power. We talked about how important the Etruscans, for example, in this similar fashion were to Rome in Italy in the same way. They're integrated and dominated, but also inferiorized and sort of mocked in the telluric dimension that they had stuck to, even though they had, in their case, likely been even probably in the European conquerors in origin and contemplated the idea of an actual godfather there, like in the Pelasgian, more feminine Pelasgian cults of Hellas, pre-Hellenic, at least Hellenic Peninsula, so to say. Now, the tribunal that you find in the Eumenides, it was itself convened, as we said also before, upon the area of Ares, the hill that had once been an Amazonian acropolis before it was raised by Theseus. And so it was not a random place either. The Amazonian cycle is different now from this one that we're looking at, because there is a Demetrian one essentially in place that the Dorians are taking over. We'll talk about those cycles at some point because they're very, very important. They sort of intersperse themselves in different eras, and we still have to open that parenthesis. But it's, again, all traditionally witnessed by these myths as well. Now, the Olympian theophany articulated, therefore, this northern luminescence in its most rarefied and exalted modality, a symbolic continuum of radiant, immortal essences rigorously sequestered from the sublunary realm of flux and corruption. Even Artemis, as we've seen, was the symbol of that transfiguration. And also, notwithstanding the sporadic genealogical narrations that appear in myth, the sacral perspectivism analogically bound to the cerulean firmaments, as much as Athena's eyes and naval eminences of the Olympus, evoking, needless to say, the Eddic Asgard, which, by the way, in the Old Norse etymology, Ansud's god plus Garda's enclosure is very similar to what, as we've seen, also being the haven of Heracles. The Vedic Meru as well, from Mer, which means mountain, Proto-Indo-European. Primordial chaos, which really means to yawn, to gap in Proto-European. Nux and Erebos, darkness, pure darkness, as inaugural generative principles antecedent to the Emera, that is to say, the Indo-European day, right? And the Aether were representing a completely different moral paradigm, right? There's an aura that descends in this world and sort of raises the veil of darkness, like with Orestes. Apollo, Athena, shield him from the Erinyes that want to take advantage of the mother killed. The mother Gaia as universal progenitrix predating the same Uranus, interestingly enough. And so a bit like the principle of the waters of the darkness, from which that is just like a great womb where God self-conceives himself. Uranus, as you know, is also like the same root word of Uranian, so very heavenly. It means to cover, sky from Proto-European where. And the pervasive contingency afflicting even divine hypotheses, these motives, although integrated into the Hesiodic syncretism, unmask this Pelasgic undercurrent that is fundamentally un-Hellenic, but still essentially merging with it as time went on. Chthonic liturgies indigenous to the Aboriginal and Pelasgic strata pulsated with a very specific term, the Deis Daimonia, which comes from the term fear of God. In Proto-European, there would be fear, and of course Deimos is God. That is probably the superstitious dread of demonic potencies infused with miasmatic contagion and necessitating apotropic expulsions and apopompai, meaning from apo, away, and pam, to send, in order to avert calamity. So in other words, not a resolution of the root cause, but the deflection of the same. It's paradoxical that when Perseus kills the Gorgo, the Medusa, he actually uses a deflective mean, but to strike at the very heart of Medusa. It was probably this visual dimension that was, as we were saying before, used to distract, to mesmerize, to attract into properly the mouths of the monster that backfires on itself, to realize essentially what she had become and what she was in practice, which cannot be hidden. Hence, the deflection of the same who tries to properly avert that. And so Deisidaimonia is one of the most beautiful concepts out there to beat this inferic, as you know, infernal, dark, feministic forces. Conversely, Achaean Olympian praxis cultivated instead a lucid, contractual engagement with beneficent celestial agencies. Again, at this point, we made lots of videos explaining how that happened. Engagements that were wholly devoid of servile apprehension and imbued instead with an elevated, though less comportment of dignified reciprocity. Right? This seemingly achieved its apex in Romanity, right? And Heracles for the Western branch. There's also the interesting figure of Hades, from the Proto-Indo-European Havid, which means unseen. And so inhabiting the netherworld, we're talking about the Olympians, but we have to understand, as we have understood in this cosmic paradigm of Hellas, what was the counterpart that was still needed. Hades awaited the generality of men in the crepuscular epoch, elicited no existential terror within this virile constituency. And it was confronted with stoic equanimity. The transcendent aspiration of the elect adhered to pyrrhic catharsis. The cadavers of heroic luminaries and magnates underwent a ritual cremation for ultimate emancipation. We've seen it in the Dorian migration. It belongs to the Urnfield culture, as a matter of fact. And this practice was diametrically opposed to the Pelasgic inhumations, symbolic restitution to the bosom of the Mother Earth. The archaic Achaean soul thus repudiated already before the Dorians penitential pathos and redemptive dramaturgy in all its forms, which is sort of weird because, again, the secular modern Greece made literally of a drama, a tragedy, a theatrical play, these myths, shunning in origin instead mystic raptures and dissolutive transports at all levels. Within the apparent syncretism of Hellenic civilization, therefore, a rigorous diacrisis is imperative. Each constituent element must be restituted to its proper and antithetical provenance, thereby disentangling the Olympian aurora from the Pelasgic penumbra that lies beneath it. And this can happen only in the higher nature, not in this world. This world needs the combination of both in order to attain the former. All right. So I'm glad we covered this because with the Olympians and the Dorian migrations, we really will come back also to late antiquity, certain Hellenistic insights. However, we mostly pertain, so to say, in the to at this point, like to an introductory phase in our sort of series here, and we had to cover the Hellenic dimension well before passing to. We don't even have an Hellenic history playlist. We must really create it, add in this stuff too, because actually write it down. Then we'll pass to something also more advanced ahead. We'll come back to Rome. We will do really a lot of very interesting stuff as far as that is concerned. And we will also come back in general on this series for the sake of, just this cyclical attitude towards the actual this is an eternal return, and we will come back often, also because we are at a point in the channel where this content is getting a bit too frequently sort of watched, and people are of all sorts are weirdly misinterpreting all what we're saying because they just have no clue in any case of this all, and they hope that I'm their friend. Right? They don't understand anything, nor about Indo-Europeistics, nor about tradition, or about Catholicism, and we're very glad that we are essentially leaving them behind. And that's essentially what the channel is all about, and for those who don't care, we don't care, all right? And they don't care about tradition, we don't care. As far as this is concerned, it's an interesting video we covered, and we can't stop here for today. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.